Yeah, well, thanks for that introduction, Shanley, and thanks to everyone for joining us here today. My name is Shane, and today I'm going to be talking about good documentation practices for clinical research. I do think this is one of the most important topics that you can be trained on as far as any sort of research goes, not just clinical research, even just basic lab research. Good documentation is important in every regulated industry. And for our institute, it's also very important because the majority of observations coming out of Health Canada inspections can really be traced back to errors in GDP. Um, so without further ado, let's discuss this. So many of you who have looked at the new PHSA SOPs might be aware that there have been some changes, and one of those changes was that the training for GDP was added as a requirement for any investigators or staff working on regulated clinical trials. And there's a number of different ways to get training on this. So this session is just one of those ways. You can also find out more about training requirements if you go to our SOP on clinical research training. And this wasn't just added because we felt like it. It really does come out of some of those new requirements that are part of the ICH GCP E6R3 update, and really reflects our best practice for research documentation. So a few different options to get this documented training, especially if you're thinking about new staff that you're hiring down the road. One of the ways is, of course, to attend this session today and receive a certificate. So everyone who registered today and attends will get a certificate sent to you hopefully by the end of this week or at least early next week. The other way for people who weren't able to make it today is you can watch the recording of this session and document the fact that you watched it on a training log. So that's another way to document the training. The other method, of course, is you can take another GDP course. There are a few different ones out there. The one that we usually recommend is from CanTrain. It's very good. It's very in-depth. However, I should note that the CanTrain platform is actually down for maintenance for this month, and it should be back online in May. So if you have staff that are joining, later in May, definitely send them to CanTrain. And before we really dig into what good documentation practices are, I want to make sure we're all on the same, start off on the same foot with acronyms, because I'm going to be mentioning a number of different acronyms throughout this presentation. So just so we're on the same page here, CRF stands for Case Report Forms. And this is really the primary data acquisition tool that is used by sites to collect information for a study. It can be paper or electronic. We see a lot of eCRFs these days. EDC is electronic data capture. This is similar to a CRF, but a little bit subtly different. This is a tool that's often utilized by a site to report that data to a sponsor. So typically an EDC platform is going to be owned and maintained by the sponsor, and then that team has access to input data. While often those case report forms are something that's kind of maintained by the site. GCP is, of course, good clinical practice, which anyone working in clinical trials has, I'm sure, heard of by now. It's our international standard for clinical research with human participants. GLP is good laboratory practice. This is an international standard for lab research, kind of similar to GCP, but it pertains more to the wet lab environment. And there's GMP. This is good manufacturing practices. It's an international standard for manufacturing, actually for pretty much all manufacturing, but importantly for us, it includes manufacturing for drugs and medical devices. And so just to situate us with where GDP really comes from, it does originally come out of GMP and GLP regulations that have existed for quite a long time. And then it's slowly been expanded to other regulated industries. So by the 1990s, it was being used as part of GCP, and very explicitly by Health Canada regulations, and FDA regulations both. So our current understanding of GDP is primarily based on the principles of ALCOA. This is an acronym that I'll cover in a few slides. So if you don't know it yet, don't worry. All of the principles within it were already found in different places throughout the regulations, but they were really formalized by an FDA inspector named Stan Woolen, who really brought it all together and created this acronym. Then later on, in 2010, the EMA, which is the regulations for clinical trials in the EU, it's the European kind of version of Health Canada, they added four additional principles, creating ALCOA Plus. And then even later on, in 2023, it was expanded to ALCOA Plus Plus with the addition of traceability for computerized systems. I won't really be covering that traceability piece because if you're using a validated system that has institutional approval, you don't have to worry quite as much about that. It's taken care of for you. But it's important to note that is now within ALCOA. So GDP, like I mentioned, is really an essential part of GCP, and that's true internationally. You won't actually find the acronym ALCOA mentioned within the new ICH GCP, but the individual elements of it are mentioned several times throughout the document. ALCOA is explicitly part of FDA regulations, though. So if you have any studies that fall under FDA's 21 CFR Part 11, ALCOA is explicitly in there. ALCOA is also explicitly mentioned throughout those EMA regulations, and individual GDP elements are once again found in Health Canada Division 5. So what is ALCOA? It is our most important acronym, and I wanted to just pause for a second and see if there is anyone on the call today that wants to shout out what a few of these letters stand for. Oh,
Attributable,
yeah, that's true. The first one is attribute.
legible, contemporaneous, um, and
Anyone else want to try for what the O and the last A stand for? Thanks, Nima. That was really great. You can also just put it in the chat. But yeah, please don't be shy.
original. Yeah,
You've got it, Nima. Yeah, original. Okay, well, let's just get into it then. So here we go. Alcoa is attributable, legible, contemporaneous, original, and accurate. And then the additional plus at the end now stands for complete, consistent, enduring, and available. So for attributable, what this really means is it must be clear who did the task that is being documented and who did the documentation. So these are sometimes different people. And it's important to note that and make it clear what you're attributing. Attribution itself can be made using someone's full written name, signatures, or initials as appropriate, depending on the kind of document it is. Electronic documents must have an audit trail that captures the identity of the staff that's adding that documentation. So that's the way attributability happens with those electronic forms. And importantly, never sign or initial on behalf of someone else. That is technically fraud. So just be very careful that the right person is signing and they're only signing for themselves. Legible. So I think we intuitively know what this means, but here's a few things to keep in mind. Ensure that all handwritten documentation is actually readable. So please don't use cursive other than for signatures. Don't use unusual fonts. So if anything is, being typed up, just use basic fonts. Don't use anything fancy. Any printouts or copies must be dark enough to be, readable and not fade with time. So make sure your printer is not running out of ink if you're printing off a document. And just remember, if documentation can't be deciphered, it's not actually useful. So it's only as useful um, as it is legible. Contemporaneous. So this means data should be recorded as soon as it's available. Dates and in some cases times should be recorded depending on what it is you're keeping track of. Visit notes should be recorded during the visit as procedures take place, or at least as soon as possible after. So this is something to really keep in mind, especially for coordinators, is that, I know we're all very busy and it can be easy to kind of put things off till later. But if something gets recorded more than 24 hours after it took place, it is considered late. And so then you may need to resort to doing like a late entry. So the best practice is, to try to get those notes and documentation down on paper or on your electronic source as it's occurring. Any events that you're documenting should be documented as soon as they occur, or at least as soon as the research team becomes aware of the event. So if you're documenting an AE, obviously you may not be present for the AE when it's happening, but as soon as the research team becomes aware, that's when you need to start documenting that. And if signatures or initials are needed on a document, it must always be accompanied by a date to show when it was signed. And of course, keep in mind, never pre-complete, post-date, or backdate entries. Once again, you should be adding that date as it's occurring, not, prior or after. Original. So this is another place where we often see errors that, get made because then there's this question of what is original, right? So when we say original, what we're really talking about is kind of the source documents, which is the first place that data was recorded. You must always maintain that to be available for review if it's part of a regulated study. If you're transcribing data from a participant medical record into, say, a CRF or an EDC, the source document is that participant medical record, not the CRF. So just be mindful of that. You do have to maintain access to that original source document. Data can be collected directly using a CRF or even in rare cases an EDC, but it must be clear from your study procedures that that is now the source document and the data is not being transcribed from another record. So if the original physical record cannot be maintained, a certified copy can be created, either physical or electronic, but this must be done appropriately and include an attestation with the signature and the date of the person who made that copy. And we do have an SOP in development for how to make those certified copies. So stay tuned for that coming soon. So accurate's another one that it feels like it should be intuitive, and we all know what accurate means. But not everyone does. So be aware that accuracy isn't just avoiding errors. It also means being precise. So you must provide the actual values, not estimates. Don't round or convert the original units when you're doing that original source documentation. You can convert units prior to entering into an EDC if that's required by the protocol, but make sure that those original source documents do have the original units that the measurement was taken in. Ensure that any device used to provide data is both calibrated and validated, and have quality control measures in place to verify data accuracy. So that's where, say, your trial monitoring comes into play. And so now that extra plus piece of ALCOA and complete is another area where, um, I think we all intuitively know what complete means, but we don't necessarily know how to carry it out. So you want to ensure that all data is collected, but sometimes data is not available or we can't complete the form entirely. So if there's extra space at the end of an entry, The proper way to note that is not just to leave it blank, but to put a single line through it. Blank pages or larger unused areas on a data collection form should have a single diagonal line through that area along with initials and date of the person that filled that out to prevent data from being added after the fact. And also remember just to document what was not done as well as what was actually done. So all of it's important. If there's something that was missed, you really should document that it was missed and why it was missed. So keep in mind these conventions when you have those blank data spaces on a CRF. You can use NA for not available, ND for not done, or UNK if it's an unknown value. And don't forget about these last ones of consistent, enduring, and available. So ensure consistency across your team and across studies. This includes things like file naming conventions, versioning, etc. Always use a ballpoint pen if you're doing handwritten documentation, and make sure that that pen is either black or blue ink, never pencil, erasable ink, fountain pens, anything like that. And I think this is a place where people have very strong opinions, actually. I have worked with teams, for instance, that insist on blue only and don't allow black. The thought behind this is that it's easier to tell if something is a copy or the original document if you document with blue ink. If it's in black ink, sometimes it's not always clear, like it could be a copy. But once again, this depends on your team, and either black or blue is acceptable in my mind. Also, make sure you ensure that all records are stored and archived in a way that makes them easily retrievable. So I also want to note that we now have a PHSA clinical trials archive tracking form. And this is going to really help both the teams and also us in the quality office to keep track of where all of your documents are located at the end of a study. So next, I'm going to discuss signatures. Because signatures are really important in any kind of documentation that we do. But I think it's easy to get really complacent with signatures. And, we're signing so many documents that often we're just signing things without even thinking about it. So do you know what you're signing and why you're signing it? So a signature on a document can have many different meanings. It's important that you add context to the form if needed to clarify what that signature is for. So a signature might denote the attribution of a task or who completed the documentation, but it might also denote who reviewed or approved of the document. It might also show medical oversight by a delegated physician. So depending on the kind of document it is, you might need multiple different people's signatures to show all those things. And of course, signatures can get really messy, and anything that's handwritten can be hard to read. So make sure that you keep documentation on hand of all the signatures and initials of everyone on your team. That way, there's a way to verify those signatures later if needed. And that helps, keep them attributable. And of course, signatures do sometimes get missed. Sometimes you need to get a late entry signature. So the appropriate way to do that, this is for those situations where the task itself did happen at the correct time, but the signature just didn't happen contemporaneously. So in this case, you need to make it clear when the task or documentation happened and when that signature was actually added. So this is basically the date that the task took place, followed by LE for late entry, and then followed by the date it was actually signed. And in some cases, it might also need an explanation for why it was missed. And so you can use electronic signatures, which actually really helps with a lot of these issues. It makes it much easier to document both at the time and for late entries. but you have to use an approved electronic platform. So for regulated trials, we have the following available at our PHSA institutions. We have real-time CTMS, we have the BCCHR instance of REDCap, and we also have PHSA DocuSign. All of these will allow you to get validated electronic signatures. I will note, however, that PHSA DocuSign is something that I think costs teams money, so um, it's probably better to stick to the first two options if you can, if it works with your study. There are sometimes other REDCap instances that teams can use, but those kind of have to be approved on a case-by-case basis. Some other notes about electronic documentation. It has to have a retrievable audit trail. It has to be a validated platform with backup systems and a disaster recovery plan in place. All users have to have unique logins, and of course can never share those login credentials. If a signed document is changed or updated within one of these electronic systems, it must be re-signed after that change was made. There are some really big pros to going electronic, though. It's much easier to capture those late entries and any changes due to that audit trail that's part of the validated platform. A lot of these platforms can flag missing information for you, and legibility is usually not an issue when you're going electronic. So not all of us work on creating documentation forms. Sometimes we just get handed these from a sponsor to use. But if you're involved in a team that has to create your own source documents, think of these following questions when you're creating them. Who will fill out each section? And is each section attributable? Is it clear who is supposed to sign each section or form? And why are they signing it? Do you have spots for both date and time when needed? Does the order of that form match the flow of a typical visit? And is it clear from your work instructions, your protocol, or maybe the form itself, which information is original and which is being transcribed from another source? So even if you're not creating these documents yourself, it's something to keep in mind when you're handed these forms. Because sometimes you can go through and push back on a sponsor and ask them to update a form if something isn't clear or you think a change should be made. Often they are actually receptive to that feedback because they want this document to work for your site. And of course, any of your source documentation should contain the following elements. You should have a page number. It should have a version. There should be a spot to list the subject ID and also a spot for the study name or protocol number. And I want to mention a little bit about versioning because it's a little bit of the Wild West out there when it comes to how teams keep track of versions. But to comply with the ALCOA principle of consistency, you want to make sure that we're using consistent methods of versioning. So one way to do that is when you're circulating those draft versions of a document, you definitely want to keep track of the changes, but keep track of them in one of the following ways. Add the date of the change to the end of that version. Add the initials of the person who made the change. Or use decimal places after the version number. And importantly, don't increase to a new whole version number until all those changes to your draft document are finalized and approved, and then you can take it up to the next version number. Otherwise, it can get very messy. We end up with, if you look at your REB submissions and you see something like, protocol version 1 and 2 followed by version 10, someone might ask what happened to those versions in between. So often those are the draft versions. So the better way to do that is just to keep track of the draft with the changes, kind of with an independent system, and then only increase to a new version number once it's actually the finalized approved document that you're going to submit to REB and that you're going to use. So now we're going to talk about errors. So mistakes happen. We all make mistakes. There's going to be mistakes in every study. That's just inevitable. The important thing to know is how to correct the errors when they occur. So never obscure the original entry. This means no whiteout, no scribbling over, don't cover it with black marker. The correct way to document correcting an error is to add a single line through the incorrect entry, followed by the correct information. You must also include the initials and date of the person who corrected it to show when it was corrected, who did it, and in most cases also why it was corrected. So if it's more than just, a spelling error, then you should explain the correction. If there's not enough room to add the correct entry on the form itself, you can always reference another page or footnote or deviation log, depending on the nature of the mistake. And that's where you can provide more information about why that error was corrected. So next, I want to go over some scenarios to help us really kind of dig into this and engage with the material. But before I do, I want to pause and just see if there are any questions about what we've covered so far, because we've gone over a lot of different topics. So is there anything that wasn't clear or that you have questions about so far in the presentation? Yeah, Jennifer.
Oh, I do have a question. So I guess it's more so in regards to the documentation, the source documentation process. For example, if our source is coming from the CST, which is the like the electronic medical records, are like the sites expected to print and authenticate each record? For example, print the entire medical chart out, or
So
is it
this
okay to?
is, yeah, this is a question we actually get a lot. So part of it is going to depend on who has access to CST. So we actually recommend it when possible that you leave the source documents where they originated. So if your source document is the participant medical record, it's better to leave it on Cerner and not print it out. However, that means that you have to be able to give access for verification of source to any monitor who needs it, auditors, or Health Canada inspectors. And we do have a way to do that. We can get, say, monitors and inspectors access to CST for the explicit purpose of verifying source documentation. But we also do have some teams where, say, their monitor has refused that access. They do not want it. In a case like that, you would actually have to print out all of those records because that's the only way they're going to have access to it. So it really is going to kind of depend on the study and the nature of the record and a little bit on your sponsor, what the answer to that is. But generally speaking, I think we are urging teams to move towards keeping CST documents just on CST and verifying when needed rather than printing them all out.
So is it safe to say that CST has a sort of audit, sort of an archiving sort of trail that sits with the institution itself then? So we don't have to worry about that
Yeah.
aspect.
Yeah, and it will not be I don't believe it's ever deleted, so it will be archived for all time on CST. Any other questions? Yeah, I also have a presentation on investigator site file where I go over source documentation in a little bit more depth if you have further questions about that.
Shane, there's a question in the chat. Can Adobe be used for electronic signatures?
Ooh, yeah, so this is something that it kind of comes down to the privacy office. I have discussed this with them previously. I don't think it's institutionally approved for clinical trials at this time. Um, it could change in the future. So if this is something that your team wants to use, reach out and we can see if there's a way for us to like get that approved. But at this time, I would say no.
Rebecca thanks you.
Yeah, there's a lot of things that go into the electronic signature. It's It's actually quite complicated, both from the regulatory standpoint and also the institutional privacy standpoint and the validation. So yeah, that's why we, definitely encourage teams to use those electronic systems like, REDCap and CTMS when they can for documents, because that is already set up and approved, so it's much easier.
Yeah, sorry, diver from the VC. We're just working with a sponsor now, and we sent them some documents. They're like, well, we actually, A, we need a wet ink, or two, has to be a properly validated system, and they won't take anything else. So
Yeah. And it's a little bit different at different institutions, right? So I think that's where some of the frustration comes in, is like maybe they have a validated instance of Adobe someplace else that they're used to using. And so then they come to us and they don't understand why they can't use the same system.
yeah, we're talking like I can't remember the term, but the FDR 21 validated, which I
Yeah.
don't know if Adobe is.
Yeah, I'd have to look into that more, but yeah. But yeah, thanks for your comment. Okay, well, if there's no other questions about GDP, let's move on to some scenarios about how we can apply GDP to our studies, into our day-to-day work life. So scenario one, the research assistant decides to jot down info on sticky notes during the visit and write up the official documentation later when they have some more time. So please, both either in the chat or just shout out and help me identify which ALCOA principles are being violated in this scenario. And full disclosure, all of these scenarios are at least loosely based on real scenarios that we've seen. And this is one that I myself have been guilty of back when I was a coordinator. So we all make mistakes, and hopefully all of us are improving all the time. So anyone from the audience, what ALCOA principles do you think are being violated here? Well, I'm not monitoring the chat, so could someone help me with the chat if there's answers in there?
There's original and contemporaneous.
Yep, those are definitely two things that are being violated in this circumstance. So, and I would throw in legible as well. So in this case, what's happening here is those sticky notes, unfortunately, are now the source documentation, because it is technically the first place that the data got written down. So if you wanted to keep that as the source documentation, which you should because that's what it is, now it might not be legible because I'm, just scribbling notes, right? If I'm trying to write up the documentation later, and just like shred those sticky notes, now I've destroyed the original source document, which is definitely a violation. And now it's not, now that documentation that I've created isn't contemporaneous or original. It's been transcribed from another source inappropriately, um, and wasn't done in a contemporaneous fashion. So I would say those are the three big ones that are being violated in this scenario. Does anyone else have any like comments or questions about this?
Paper towels are bad too.
Yeah, no, I would say anything other than those official source documents that you have created and have in place for your documentation for the study. That's why we have those, is that is our method of collecting the data, right? So if you're jotting down notes on anything else, it's probably wrong. It's too easy to get lost. If this happens, like we have, sometimes we rely on other people in the clinical team that may not understand how prescriptive our GDP is, and say maybe a nurse writes down the patient's height and weight on a sticky note for you and hands that to you. In that case, the best thing to do is to keep that sticky note with the rest of your documentation, staple it to the other documentation, so that's not lost, and just make it very clear on your form that that is the source that you're using. Okay, scenario two. So in this scenario, the physician completed exam notes on a paper CRF and signed, but forgot to include the date. The clinical research coordinator notices that the date is missing after the physician has already left for the day. So to be helpful, they go ahead and just write the date in for them next to the signature. So what would be wrong about this scenario? What ALCOA principles are being violated here? And I will start picking on people if no one answers. So do we have anyone in the chat?
We've got attributable.
Yeah,
This is
attributable.
what happens when
This
you're
is a
trying to eat
mouthful. Yeah, thanks. Whoever put that in the chat, that's correct. I would say the main thing that's going wrong here is the attributability. And this is actually something that has come up in past Health Canada inspections. So sometimes those inspectors will actually look at that handwriting and say, hey, that the handwriting on the date doesn't match the pen used or the handwriting for the signature doesn't match, the previous dates. And they will point that out. So it is not good GDP practice to do that. Never add initials, date, or anything else on someone else's behalf. That should always be the person who was doing the signature who also writes the date in that case. Do you have any other questions about this? Because this is really easy to do, right? It's very well intentioned. You're just trying to make sure that everything's complete. But yeah, in this case, should wait and get the physician to add that date when they're back in the office. And to be extra confusing, it would be technically a late entry date that you'd have to add. Okay, scenario 3. So in this scenario, the clinical research coordinator is preparing the CRFs ahead of time that they're going to be using for that study visit. The study procedure is already scheduled for a particular time. So they decide to go ahead and pre-fill both the date and time for all the procedures that they're going to do that day while they're at it. So which principles are going to be violated by this scenario? I will start picking on people I haven't heard from yet. How about Eliza? What do you think, Eliza?
Contemporaneous?
Yep, that's definitely one of them. There's one other that's very important, though.
Someone posted accurate in the chat as well.
Yep, that's correct. So I would say contemporaneous and accurate are the two principles being violated here. You should never fill in anything like that ahead of time. You can fill in things like, the name of the study, things that obviously are not going to change, but anything that has to be that's important for accuracy should never be done in advance. So we all know how things go with a study visit. Just because it's scheduled for a particular time doesn't mean that's actually going to happen at that exact time. And in this case, estimations are not accurate enough. You do want to have the exact time that it happened. So yeah, never do that. Wait until the procedure is actually happening or occurred, and then you can add that time. Okay, scenario 4. So in this scenario, the research nurse wants to make sure that they are documenting on eSource in a contemporaneous manner, but they forgot their real-time password again. So they ask a colleague if they can use their login credentials to access eSource during the visit. So what's the problem here? Other than this is obviously a violation of the real-time SOP and institutional policy, but there's also an ALCOA piece that's violated here. Do we have anything in the chat? Otherwise, I'm going to call on Sabrina.
We have attributable in the chat.
Yep, that's correct. So in this case, on top of the other kind of egregious violations that this would cause by using someone else's login credentials, it also means that your documentation is no longer attributable because it would look like that other person was the one who documented the visit. Okay, scenario 5. A new research coordinator is going through the paper binders for the study that they are taking over and notices that the previous coordinator on that study had really messy handwriting. They know that legibility is part of ALCOA, so they decide to rewrite the messiest documents so that they are easier to read in case of an inspection. So what would be the problem here? There's going to be a few different principles that are violated by this.
We've got original in the chat. That word I can say.
Yeah, so original is definitely one of them because now, if say they shred that old document and just keep the new one, now they don't have the original document anymore, so it's no longer original. What are some other things?
Someone suggests all of them.
Just about. I would say the most important ones that are being violated here is the original, accurate, and attributable. So it's definitely not going to be attributable because now it's in some new person's handwriting. It's not original, and it's potentially not accurate as well because, if it was hard to read to begin with, now whatever they've transcribed might not actually be correct, right? They might have misinterpreted it. So it's all around a bad scenario. It's also bad that it wasn't legible to begin with, but at that point, the only thing you can do is add additional documentation. So you never want to take anything away, but you can add clarification if needed. So if they see that it's not very legible, they might write up some, note to file or something like that that explains some of the pieces that aren't easy to read, in order to add to that documentation. So are there any other like questions about this scenario or anything anyone wants to add? Any comments? Okay, well, moving on to the last scenario then. Thanks for bearing with me with all these different scenarios. So a physician assesses an AE for a study participant, resulting in a diagnosis that they later realize is incorrect after some more test results come back. The physician wants the study record to be as accurate as possible, so they discard the first AE assessment and replace it with a new AE assessment with the correct diagnosis. So what's wrong in this scenario? I see we probably have a bunch of answers in the chat.
We've got original many times.
Yep, that's definitely the case. What are the other couple ones that are being violated here? Anyone want to shout it out from the audience? Anyone feel brave? How about David? We haven't heard from David yet.
Hello. Yeah, I think it's definitely originals up there. Contemporaneous for sure as well, because it wasn't recorded at the time of, right? He's recording it after. So that's definitely a
Yeah.
problem as well. He is making it more accurate. So he's kind of going for more Alcoa in that sense, but he's losing it in the other two. So it's kind of a weird balance, right? But
Yeah.
yeah,
So
I think that's what I'm going with.
yeah, thank you. That's perfect. So I think you're touching on exactly what I want to get at here, which is that sometimes it's easy to misinterpret Alcoa in a way that actually causes problems, right? So the physician is thinking about accuracy and thinks, oh, well, it's the more um, the more accurate diagnosis is what's going to make this more accurate. But that's not really correct when it comes to documentation. So it's important to document what actually occurred, when it occurred, how it occurred. So you need both diagnoses, right? You need to have the documentation of the original incorrect diagnosis, and then later you can add the new diagnosis as you get more information. So it's important that you're documenting all of that. You don't want to lose that original piece where the incorrect diagnosis was made because that could be important for the study. Um, and even if this is well-intentioned, it could look like fraud to an outside observer, right? It could look like maybe the physician was trying to save face about making an incorrect diagnosis. So it's very important that you never get rid of any of that original documentation. If there was something that was incorrect or an error was made, you can always add additional documentation that explains that. That says, after we got, more results back, I updated this diagnosis to something that was more correct. Any more thoughts or comments on this scenario? Yeah, so I guess one thing about this that I think is also like that ties into maybe all these scenarios is that we all want things to kind of look pretty as well, right? Like we don't like it when it's, kind of a messy, like back and forth with the diagnosis, or that there's messy documentation that we now have to explain. And so it seems like it might be easier just to replace a document, but really it's okay if things are kind of messy and there's extra pages and we have to go back and add more documentation. That is actually the correct way to do it. And sometimes we also do things to that we think are going to save us time and be more efficient. But correct documentation sometimes does take a little longer, and we just have to allow for the time to do it properly. And in the long run, I think you'll find that doing it properly the first time will actually save you time, because then you don't have to go back and fix things later.
Hi, Shane. There's a couple of suggestions in the chat for you in terms of what might be the solution for that.
Oh yeah, go. Can you read those
So
out for me?
yes, so Travis is wondering follow-up AE report would presumably be the solution.
Yeah.
And Jessica's wondering if a potential solution might be a single line cross out initials and date and indicate the reason for correction. Maybe you could speak to both.
Yeah, so I would go with that first option in this case, because so it would be one thing if that original diagnosis, they made the correct diagnosis but wrote it down wrong. In that case, it would be an error correction. They meant to write, diagnosis A, but they accidentally wrote diagnosis B, and so they did the correct thing. They made the correct diagnosis. It was just the documentation that was mistaken. Then you can do the error correction later and explain that you had written it down wrong. If they actually made an incorrect diagnosis and then just later got, enough information to make the correct diagnosis, you just need to add an additional documentation to show that is the correct way to do that.
Awesome. Thanks, Shane. And then Mateus also just commented, so perhaps we should stop using paper altogether. Maybe it's
You
causing
know,
problems.
I absolutely agree with that 100%. Honestly, electronic documentation actually eliminates and prevents a lot of ALCOA errors, because some of those validated systems makes it kind of impossible for you to do some of these things, right? So if this was, say, this AE was documented on an electronic platform, it would live there forever. Even if it was, corrected later or stuff was added later, there would always be that audit trail showing that original diagnosis. It could always be recovered. If it's paper, that's where you can get into trouble because, paper can be lost, it can be shredded. Um, there's a lot more that can go wrong with paper documentation versus the electronic documentation, is in some ways a little bit more permanent. Although you do get the additional risk of, say, like hackers or issues with electronic platforms going down. So you always have to have a backup plan for if, the network goes down and then you need to revert to paper temporarily. But overall, going electronic, I think solves a lot more problems than it creates. So I have a little answer key for people who are looking at the slides later. And I also just want to end today with this reminder that if it's not documented, it didn't happen. So as far as any research goes, whether this is in a wet lab or a clinical environment, the documentation really is the key to all of that research, right? And I think another part of this is that, a lot of times in research, it really pays to sort of like get creative and think outside of the box. And we definitely encourage that in some cases. But when it comes to GDP, please do not get creative. GDP is actually very prescriptive. In most cases, there's only one way to do it correctly. So make sure you're double checking that you are doing that right, that you are correcting your, errors in the right way, that you are adding those late entry signatures in the right way. It is important. And I will be sending out a really handy kind of couple page sheet that you can reference when we send out those certificates that was created by Peter over in the HEMONC team at BC Children's. So he was kind enough to share that with us and let us share it with all of you. And that way your team will have a handy reference on hand. If you want additional GDP training, like I was mentioning earlier, there is a course from CamTrain that is offered free of charge to anyone with a PHSA account. There is also a pretty good course on Citi, except that one does cost quite a bit of money to sign up for. And there's also a free presentation from the FDA that you can download that covers a lot of topics, including some additional ones that I didn't go into today. And if you have any questions, I think we still have plenty of time today to go over them, but you can always email us if you come up with something later. And keep in mind that the quality team does keep everything confidential between us and your team. So if you come up with, some mistake that happened or something you need to help getting fixed, definitely reach out to us and we'll do our best to find a solution that works for your team.
Shane, can I put you on the spot?
Oh, absolutely. That's what I'm here for.
In the appendix of that SOP, there's a additional resource. There's a 3-minute and 33-second ALCOA video.
Yes, there is a
Would
nice little video.
that suffice as training for a team, or does it need to be a little bit more comprehensive?
No, I would say that one is more like a handy reference guide. It's very short. It does cover ALCOA.
It's very good though.
It is good. I
It's
agree.
very
And
good.
that's why we offer it there.
Yeah.
However, I don't think it would count as full GDP training, which is why we're recording the session today, and we'll be making the recording of this session available in order to document that training.
Thank you.
You're getting some thank yous in the chat. And I don't know, Shane, if you can see the chat now
yeah,
that
I
your
can see the
slides
chat
are
now.
gone, but Ivor and Travis were just having a conversation about eSource and how to maybe get around that without paying for exorbitant amounts of cost.
Yeah, so I'm sorry, I feel like I didn't leave a lot of time for questions, but we still have 5 minutes, so if anyone I can also stay a little bit later if people have additional questions and have the time to stay.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Shane. That was such a well-attended Lunch and Learn presentation. I know folks were really excited about this one, so thank you so much for coming to present. Like Shane mentioned, you can reach out to him in the quality office at any time for additional questions.